What's up, guys? Montero ranting with the Canelo shill cap for you guys. I love trolling the trolls. Anyway, wanted to get my thoughts. I know a lot of you have been asking about Golovkin being stripped by the IBF, but I wanted to wait a day to kind of see what the reaction was going to be. And I went back and forth on Twitter with a bunch of you guys yesterday. I've seen some of the podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff like that. A lot of it's pretty predictable, right? The reaction. And I had a little poll on my Twitter. About 2/3 of you seem to think Golovkin and his team are doing the right thing, but about a third of you feel that he's being sellout. And, you know, that kind of is par with the course. I kind of understand it. So before I even get into this, and I want to put a little historical perspective to it as well, and I'll do that in this rant. But before I even go forward with that, I just want to make it very, very clear. You know, a lot of the people commenting about this really do not have all the information. Especially some of the YouTube channels and stuff. Clearly, they're not understanding some of the information involved with all these dealings. But look, I've talked to Lou DiBella on the phone about this whole subject with Golovkin, Derevyanchenko. I've talked to Tom Leoffler on the phone and in person about this subject multiple times. And then those of you who subscribe to Ring Magazine and have the latest issue, you saw my piece on Canelo and clenbuterol gate. And you know that I talked to various people involved in that situation, which involves Golovkin. So needless to say, I've talked directly with the people related to this entire situation multiple times over the last really month plus as it's all evolved and played out. So my perspective here, I would say, is firsthand, right? Talking to people firsthand. It's not a guy who knows a friend of a friend of a friend who told me a rumor. Okay, so just wanted to put that out there and preface it. First things first, right now the situation with the IBF, okay? Derevyanchenko, Lou DiBella, they made it very, very clear. And Lou told me personally, their mission was not to get Golovkin stripped. That was not their mission. Their mission was to get the fight and, quite frankly, the payday. And Lou, I thought, did a great job. He did what he's supposed to do is for a promoter, or a promoter, what they're supposed to do for a fighter. Is fight and use any angle you can to get a guy who, let's face it, Derevyanchenko is not a name. Nobody knows who he is. Now suddenly he's got a little bit of a name. Not with mainstream fans or anything, but even among diehards. There's a lot of diehards who didn't know the guy's name. Now suddenly people are talking about him and he's a player now. And that's honestly, Lou DiBella did a great job in this situation, pushing the IBF and ranting a little bit and making a case for his guy. And now, over the next 6 to 18 months, Derevyanchenko is in a really, really good spot to make money that ultimately, or before, he wasn't going to make. And I'll explain all that in a second. But as it stands right now, Derevyanchenko, number 1 on the IBF. There's no number 2 for some reason. That doesn't make any sense to me. But number 3 is Daniel Jacobs, who doesn't have a fight scheduled. Number 4, Jermall Charlo, who, yes, is in line for the WBC title, but clearly him and his team have to know Golovkin and Canelo are fighting September 15th. So that title shot's on hold. If I'm Charlo and Jacobs doesn't want to go after this title shot with Derevyanchenko, I'm banging the drums for Derevyanchenko. Either way, the IBF, if they're going to do the right thing here, and they're saying that it's it's Derevyanchenko versus the highest available contender. Right now, that's Daniel Jacobs, but right after him is Jermall Charlo, and right after him, at number 5, is Demetrius Andrade, who hasn't fought since last, I want to say October, maybe September, October. So it's got to be one of those 3 guys. Personally, for me, I'd love to see Jermall Charlo because, you know, Jermall Charlo hasn't fought an elite level fighter yet. And we haven't seen Derevyanchenko fight an elite level fighter yet. Throughout the history of boxing, in this kind of situation, if you're trying to get a big fight with the man, which right now is Golovkin / Canelo, he's the money man, you got to fight another guy on your level, another contender, to show which one is the true contender, which one's the pretender, right? So in a perfect world, 2 guys like Derevyanchenko and Charlo, they'd fight each other right now for that IBF title. That to me would be the best case scenario. I don't think it's going to happen, Daniel Jacobs has proven himself. He is a top elite level middleweight. He doesn't need to fight a guy, in my opinion, like a Charlo or whoever else to earn a title shot. He could go right into a title shot. So if he wants to fight Derevyanchenko, I'd be totally cool with that. Not as necessarily interested in that though. I'd like to see Charlo and Derevyanchenko fight because I want to see which guy has that extra level. Which guy is going to be an elite level top middleweight and which guy is just under that. Those two guys should fight. I'd love to see that, but I really, really doubt we're going to see it. So anyway, that's what's up right now with the IBF, and we got to see what their ruling is going to be and the players involved. But it better be Derevyanchenko versus either Jacobs or Charlo. If it's not, that's a damn shame. And even Andre, who's rated number 5, is he really deserving of a title shot? He hasn't fought going on a year now, and he didn't fight a top-level guy last time he was in the ring. So to me, Derevyanchenko versus either Jacobs or Charlo or bust. That's what I want to see. Okay, now, I wanted to give you guys just my feelings on this whole Golovkin situation. Let's be clear. Technically, he was stripped. Golovkin didn't give up the title. Okay, so some of you didn't like my semantics on Twitter last night because I was basically saying Golovkin made a business decision to dump this IBF title to go after the Canelo rematch, which is what he's wanted all along. Strictly business decision. And look, a win over Canelo legacy-wise is bigger than a win over Derevyanchenko, at least at this current time. Canelo's the big guy in the sport right now. So, and then they have history, blah, 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 blah. Strictly business decision. Also legacy to go after Canelo and dump the IBF title. Now I get it. Golovkin didn't take off his IBF belt and dump it in the trash. But by not agreeing to the terms the IBF mandated, which by the way kind of did not go by their typical processing timeline rules for mandatories. So the way the IBF handled this situation, I do feel was quite unfair. And there isn't really a historical precedent for it because this whole fiasco, this whole blow up of the middleweight division was caused by Canelo Alvarez consuming performance enhancing drugs. That's what caused all of this. If that didn't happen, we've already would have seen the Canelo Golovkin rematch and now the mandatory situations would be doled out. And to make it clear, the WBC and the IBF and the WBA, they had all come together and agreed the WBC mandatory was going to come first, then the IBF mandatory. So Derevyanchenko, had the Golovkin-Canelo rematch happen May 5th, Derevyanchenko wasn't going to get his title shot in 2018. He was going to have to wait until 2019. Per the agreement all the sanctioning organizations had made before the rematch was even signed. That's a huge fact, not opinion, that a lot of these Golovkin haters and all these people making clickbait, blah, 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 keep glancing over. Either because they just simply don't know it, they haven't talked to the parties involved, or they're choosing to ignore it to push an agenda. Okay, so because Canelo screwed up, that is what thrust Derevyanchenko into the mix. They were on hold until Charlo was going to go next. It was going to be the WBC and then the IBF. So again, Lou DiBella taking advantage of this situation, in my opinion, did the right thing for his fighter. I ain't mad at him at all. I ain't mad at Team Derevyanchenko at all for playing it the way they did. I'm actually, the IBF kind of screwed this one up in my opinion. I mean, because, well, look, I could go back and forth with what they decided with the WBC. Anyway, the historical precedent here is unique, and I could see why Team Golovkin and Tom Leoffler are quite upset. They've played by the IBF's rules. We could go back and talk about the fight, the title defense against Daniel Jacobs last year and how the rehydration rule hurt Golovkin and was advantageous to Jacobs. We could talk about that kind of stuff. Now, the IBF realized that and made changes to the rules by the time Golovkin fought Canelo. But all things considered, Golovkin and his team paid all the sanctioning dues, abided by all the rules. And by the way, Leoffler paid them $20,000, just a $20,000 check. Boom, here you go. In April, to get basically for the IBF to allow them to do a non-sanctioned fight against Ivanis Martirosyan. The IBF did not recognize that fight, so that I guess technically that's not a title defense of the IBF for Golovkin anyway against Martirosyan. So I don't even think they give a shit right now about the IBF. But yeah, literally he had to write a $20,000 check to them, just cut a check, it wasn't a sanctioning due, nothing, just to be allowed to do that fight. And then they mandated, hey man, by August 3rd, you got to fight Derevyanchenko. Now I've talked about all this in the previous video, so I'm not going to rehash all of it. But that timeline of events and the processing is not normally what the IBF does. So in my opinion, I don't see Golovkin and his team doing anything wrong here. I think it's obviously the smarter play to go for Canelo and $20 million plus when Derevyanchenko is going to bring $2+ million. Yes, there'd be foreign TV money and sponsorships and all that kind of stuff. But Derevyanchenko was going to bring 1/10 of the revenue of Canelo Alvarez. Money always matters, especially at this stage of Golovkin's career. And that's why I wanted to get to, just from a historical perspective, I wanted to compare to Marvin Hagler's situation at certain times and to Bernard Hopkins' situation. Okay? Because some of you guys on Twitter have been saying, well, Marvin Hagler wouldn't have pulled this. He would have defended his title. And, Bernard Hopkins wouldn't have done this. They cared about legacy and defending the titles and blah, blah, blah. Guys, from a historical perspective, again, this is totally unique, this situation. But also, if you look at the paydays, the payday that's on the line right now for Triple G against Canelo, who's the only money man in and around his weight class. The only other money man right now in the sport is Anthony Joshua. Obviously, Golovkin's not fighting him. So this opportunity he has to not only make that huge money, but to right the wrong of the draw last September, because most people, myself included, thought Golovkin won that fight. So, and also having that win over that pay-per-view star takes you to an upper echelon, right? Golovkin's never going to be the star Canelo is for demographic reasons. But that win is very, very important from a business perspective. So it makes total sense why they make this play. Some of you have talked about Marvin Hagler. Let's go back, and I just want to give you guys some numbers that you might not be considering, okay? And I get it. Different era. From a demographics perspective, Hagler was way more marketable. Boxing was in a much bigger position back in the 70s and 80s. I got you. But just from just for argument's sake, just hear me out for a second, okay? Hagler went pro. He was about 19 years old in 1973. Now, obviously, you already know Golovkin went pro in 2006 at a very, very advanced age. So we can't really compare that. But Hagler goes pro in 73. It took him 10 years to get a payday type fight against a star. And that was in 83 against Roberto Duran, who started his career as a lightweight and did his best work as a lightweight. So Hagler was essentially fighting a guy who started at lightweight and did some good work at welterweight, but fighting a much smaller man, but a star at that point. It was a brand building type of fight for Hagler. So in 1983, 10 years in, November of 83, he fights Duran. Hagler's 29 years old. Now, yes, he went pro early, 10 years in, only 29. Different era, fighters age quicker back then, I hear you, but only 29. Keep Triple G's age in the back of your mind as I go into this, okay? He fights Duran. He was guaranteed $5 million, Hagler was. Now, and Duran was only guaranteed $1.5 million. Hagler, $5 million. A lot of you guys, especially you millennials, are hearing that and thinking, well, that ain't shit. $5 million? Triple G could get that if he rematches Jacobs. $5 million in 1983, guys. I just went on the computer, and I think it was a calculator that Forbes has, an inflation calculator, and you could put in an amount in a particular year and see what it would be today. $5 million in 1983 is $12.5 million today. So the equivalent, basically, of what Golovkin just made against Canelo last September, and Golovkin was 35. So put that in the back of your mind. Golovkin 35 before he's getting that first massive payday. Hagler 29 against Duran. Massive payday, right? Now, 2 years later, in April 1985, Hagler fights Hearns, a welterweight, basically, who had moved up, right? He was 31 years old when he fights Hearns. He made 5.6 million, Hearns 5.4 million. So it was like a 51-49% purse split. 5.6 million in 1985 is worth 13 million today. So he gets a second massive payday, the equivalent of an 8-figure payday today against Hearns. April 1987, Hagler's 33 years old, he fights Sugar Ray Leonard, right? The big, massive fight, the biggest payday available for Hagler at the time. There was really nobody else that could come close to that. Hagler made 20 million. He was guaranteed, I believe, 12 million, and then he got pay-per-view upside, but he made over $20 million with all the upside that came in from the revenue of the fight. 20 million in 1987. Leonard ended up making about 12 million. When you adjust for inflation, guys, Hagler made about $44 million in today's money in that fight against Leonard. He was 33 years old. The decision didn't go his way. A lot of people, myself included, felt that he probably should have got the nod, but he walked away at that point. And a lot of you have said that was noble of him. He said, screw boxing, I'm not coming back. Well, you just made $44 million. It's a lot easier to say screw boxing when, think about today's money. He had made $25 million plus against Duran and Hearns, and then he made about $44 million against Leonard. A lot easier to walk away and say, screw you, I should have got that decision, I'm gonna have this noble cause, when you've made collectively, I'm just doing math in my head right here, about $70 million plus in your 3 signature fights. To compare Hagler's situation to what Golovkin just did in dumping his belt is asinine. And I've seen some of the YouTube channels and the Twitter people do that. Absolutely ridiculous, guys. Completely different situations. Now, some of you would say Triple G's career is more comparable to Bernard Hopkins. Hopkins went pro in 1988. He was 23 years old. That's an advanced age to go pro in boxing, but still not the age that Golovkin was, right? He was still, I think, younger than Golovkin was at that time. Just maybe around the same age, maybe a year or so younger. But here's some differences with B-Hop. Loses his pro debut, whatever, that's a throwaway. But that loss to Roy Jones Jr. in 93, that was a setback, and he had to rebuild himself. So it took him a while to kind of rebuild himself after that loss, because like I just talked about earlier in this video, about a guy like Derevyanchenko and Charlo fighting, which one goes on to that next level, and which guy, has to rebuild. That's kind of what that fight was. Not the exact same. I'm not trying to compare the fighters in terms of legacy or anything like that, but that was kind of the same type of fight with Hopkins and Jones. Jones wins, almost dominates. He clearly wins that fight. So Hopkins had to rebuild. So from 93, he rebuilds himself. Ends up winning a title. There ends up being a middleweight tournament, basically. And in September of 2001, he fights Felix Trinidad. So he had been a pro for about 13 years at that point. 13 years before he gets Tito Trinidad. He had to rebuild himself, back up, gets Tito Trinidad. Now, in that fight, Trinidad was clearly the A side, and Hopkins was the B side. Trinidad got $9 million. That was the reported purse. After the upside in the foreign TV and the rights and all that, he made an 8-figure payday. This is in 2001. So even then, you adjust for inflation, Tito did really, really well in that fight. Hopkins only got $2.5 million. Today, maybe that's $5 million. I don't even think. But Hopkins, again, B side. That was A plus and B minus side for that fight. But once Hopkins won, he went up another echelon, right? September 2004, B-Hop's big moment. His version of Triple G's Canelo was B-Hop's Oscar De La Hoya. In September 2004, he fights him. Oscar, $30 million. And B-Hop gets $10 million. They both got some upside. After B-Hop wins that fight, he becomes not necessarily a star. He was never going to be a crossover star because of his fighting style. He was very, very dull to watch and more of a spoiler. That's how he fought. Now, the Trinidad fight was actually exciting and he was quite entertaining in that fight. But for the most part, B-Hop was a spoiler, and he had stinkers. But after that point, he was able to. Let me put it to you this way. After that big fight against Oscar, which he clearly won, and again, Oscar started his career as a lightweight, did the bulk of his work at welterweight, and then moved up, fighting a bigger or a smaller man. After that, Hopkins defended the title a couple times, cashed in a little bit, fights Jermaine Taylor. I think he made $5 million plus, upside and everything in those two fights. Loses. Does he stay at middleweight and toil there? No. He goes for money. So there was fights against Antonio Tarver, Winky Wright, Kelly Pavlik. Those were at catchweights, most of them. But they were money fights. There was a fight against Calzaghe, which was a good money fight for him. At that point, B-Hop chased the money. He was at a point in his career where he had climbed the mountaintop. He had gotten his big payday against De La Hoya, lost those fights to Taylor, and at that point, he kind of went for money. And he had a career there at light heavyweight for a while and made money. For Triple G, okay, pro in 2006, it takes him 11 years to get Canelo Alvarez. He's 35 years old. He makes 8 figures. He's 36 years old now. He has a style that's much different from Hopkins, who, again, more of a spoiler. His style lasted very long. Triple G's style, while not exactly like Hagler, is more similar to that sort of style. And that style fades quicker. So from a style perspective, from an athletic perspective, from a size perspective, he's more comparable to Hagler. I talked about Hagler's timeline, how old he was when he got those paydays and everything else, and when he rode off into the sunset. Golovkin's much older. He's only gotten one of those big paydays. Guys, it makes total sense for him at this point to dump a title. And by him moving forward to fight Canelo, that was essentially him knowing he was going to be stripped. The IBF told him they were going to strip him. It was a indirect way of dumping the title. So I don't mean that disrespectfully. I understand Golovkin didn't throw it in the trash, but you guys, I'm paraphrasing here, okay? He dumps that title to fight Canelo. Why would anyone criticize that at this point? Now, some of you are saying, all the belts, all the belts, all the belts. That's been their hashtag. They want all the belts. Yeah, hashtags are for marketing. Hashtags change. Marketing, your marketing strategy changes at different parts of your career. Pretty Boy Floyd became Money May Floyd at one point, right? Guys change tactics depending on the stage of their career that they're in and what their goals are. I think it's very clear to everybody, and I've been telling you guys this for the last 12 plus months. Come hell or high, no, not 12 months. I'll take that back. Since last September. What the hell is that? 8-9 months. I've been telling you guys, come hell or high water, the fight that Golovkin and his team want next is the Canelo rematch. And no matter what happens, that's the fight that's going to happen. So nobody could predict this clenbuterol thing, but they still want that damn fight. And all the 50-50 talk, they know they're not going to get 50%. That's a way to bump up the 65-35 split. It's a negotiating tactic for any of you to think that that's a legitimate statement and that is exactly how Golovkin really truly feels. You're crazy. How long have you been following boxing? This is how negotiations happen now. That's all that is. I don't know why you guys can criticize this man for wanting to go for this paycheck. Now, here's a scenario that I think a lot of you might not be playing in your head, and because you're so emotionally pissed off about Golovkin not fighting Derevyanchenko for whatever reason, and fulfilling his mandatory, and living up to the all the belts hashtag, blah, blah, blah. What if, I don't know, call me crazy, what if Golovkin beats Canelo September 15th, fights Ryota Murata for another 10-figure payday this December 31st, fulfills his mandatory obligation against Charlo next spring, or maybe that gets bumped later in 2019, but along the way, finally gets the unification match with Billy Joe Saunders or Sergiy Derevyanchenko. What if Saunders continues to do what he's doing and just doesn't want any part of it? What if Golovkin fights Murata December, and then next spring or summer fights Derevyanchenko to unify and ends up getting that IBF title back. Is that such a horrible thing? What if he might tell the IBF to go screw themselves and defend the WBC mandatory? Maybe that's the play he goes for. I don't know. I would think they'd rather fight Derevyanchenko first before Charlo, but we don't even know. Charlo might fight Derevyanchenko first, so he might have to face Charlo anyway. Charlo might end up with that IBF belt. Who knows? We don't know at this point. But what I'm saying is, whoever has the IBF title next year, if Golovkin ends up fighting him then, unifying that title, getting it back, and or eventually fighting Saunders and getting that WBO title, is it such a bad thing? Is it so wrong of him to want to get that big payday again against Canelo and right that wrong, and or get a big payday against Ryota Murata in Tokyo, and by the way, handle his eventual WBA mandatory, which will be Murata? Is it such a bad thing if in the end he comes around next year and fulfills the mandatories or unifies titles and ends up getting all the belts anyway, or at least most of them? If you're Golovkin, your team Golovkin, you're thinking long term, you're thinking, and as a promoter, Tom Leoffler is promoter, as a promoter, you're always thinking 3 steps ahead. You have to focus on the current situation, but you're playing chess. You have to think 2 or 3 moves ahead. If you're thinking 24 months ahead, and that's all part of your plan, what's the big freaking deal? Some of you are just really impatient. Now, if Golovkin fights Canelo, fights Murata, and then in 2019 dumps all of his belts and moves up to 168 and goes for the money, I'll be the first to call him out on that. Now, if he moves up to 168 and fights the best super middleweight in the world, different story. That's a different story. That's historic kind of stuff. But if he just goes for one-off money fights after this year, doesn't fulfill his mandatory obligations, look, I'll be the first to criticize. But at this point, this guy's fought every mandatory put in front of him. Let the dude fight Canelo again. And by the way, okay, it is the biggest fight in boxing. It's actually bigger than, at this point, it's actually bigger than Joshua Wilder. And I know some of you are going to go, get out of here, no way. Yes, wait. Golovkin, Canelo 2, Canelo Golovkin 2, however you want to put it, makes more money, does more pay-per-view buys this year than Joshua Wilder. Whether it's in the UK or in America, whatever. And that shouldn't be a controversial statement. Anyone who follows the sport or has been following it or paying attention the last 3, 4, 5 years and knows the structure of pay-per-view and how it's changed so drastically and everything else right now and how these deals are all worked out, that shouldn't be a controversial statement. That should be, oh yeah, no shit. So it's the biggest fight in the sport. That's what fans should want right now. Next year, 2019, the biggest fight in the sport will be Joshua Wilder. And as I've been telling you guys all along, that fight will happen next year. This summer, Wilder is going to fight Brazil, and it looks like Joshua's going to fight Povetkin, as I've been telling you guys for months now. So anyway, think long term, guys. Have patience. Let the process play out. It's like some of you with the Canelo clenbuterol scandal. You didn't like my reporting up front because I wouldn't just pound my fist on the table, boom, and just be like, Canelo's dirty. He cheated. He's a steroid abuser. He probably punches puppies and kills babies too, and he sacrifices goats to honor the Dark Lord, Satan. I didn't just jump out and say that. In the first 60 seconds that story broke, and some of you jumped down my throat. But the process played out. I presented all the information. Pick up the latest issue of Ring Magazine and read my article there where I lay it all out with a timeline. It's the most comprehensive piece on the clenbuterol scandal that there is right now in any magazine. You guys have all disappeared. So this current position that Golovkin and the whole middleweight division, which is all over the damn place, is in. Guys, be patient. Give it time to play out. A year from now, a year from today, we'll be in a much better place. Trust me. And by the way, one last point before I stop ranting here. I talked to Tom Leoffler last week, all right? I know I've already mentioned that. But I forgot to mention this point. Leoffler made it clear. They were more than willing to fight Derevyanchenko, more than willing to meet that mandatory obligation. They simply wanted to fight Canelo first. They wanted the original agreed upon timeline to play out. They wanted Canelo first. That's it. If the IBF had worked with them and allowed them to fight Canelo first and found some way to make that work, probably at the end of this year, or maybe early next year, probably more early next year, Golovkin would have fought Derevyanchenko. It would have happened. But in doing what they did, the IBF screwed themselves out of a six-figure sanctioning fee for the Golovkin-Canelo rematch that's going to happen in September. They also screwed themselves out of another six-figure sanctioning fee from the Golovkin-Murata match that's going to happen in December. So they screwed themselves out of almost seven figures in total revenue that they could have got from Golovkin this year. High six figures anyway, in sanctioning fees for those two fights that are going to happen. They kind of screwed themselves. The person they really did a favor to is Derevyanchenko, because if Derevyanchenko, regardless of who he fights, if he gets that IBF title, he defends it once or so, and then ends up getting a unification fight with Golovkin, or if Canelo beats him, he gets a unification fight with Canelo, he's going to make significantly more in a unification fight than he would have got in a mandatory fight against Golovkin. He would have got six figures in a mandatory, title challenge against Golovkin this year. That's what he would have got. So now he's in a position where eventually, if he does get that IBF title and he unifies with Golovkin or Canelo, he's going to get seven figures. So he actually is the one that got hooked up in this whole deal. Duh, right? No shit. But if you think about it, the IBF really screwed themselves, because the sanctioning fees they're going to get from the Derevyanchenko title defenses are significantly less, a fraction of what they would have got for the Golovkin title defenses. So in a way, I give the IBF a lot of credit for sticking to their guns here. But from a business perspective, I don't know. Now, it'd be one thing if they absolutely followed their typical normal procedures, but they didn't here. So they were in such a rush to strip this dude. I don't know. Either way, they're out money. But guys, I've ranted enough on this. I'm sorry if I bored the hell out of you. I just wanted to make sure I got everything out of my brain on here. Let me know what you guys think. Comment below, like, share, subscribe. And by the way, if you haven't got over to Apple Podcast and subscribe to the Neutral Corner podcast, please do so. And drop a rating and review while you're at it. All right? I'll see you at the fights.